So good afternoon, dear colleagues. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the next webinar in the TrueDem series dedicated to political trust research. And today we are very pleased to host a timely and thought-provoking presentation entitled Building Trust in Political Office, Testing the Efficacy of Political Contact and Authentic Communication. This talk addresses a critical question: what can politicians actually do to build trust? Well, much has already been written about the causes of declining political trust. Less attention has been attributed to the strategies that can actually counter this trend. And today's session takes us directly to this important question. Our invited speaker today is Dr. James Weinberg, a senior lecturer in political science at the University of Sheffield and director of education in the School of Sociological Studies, Politics and International Relations. He's also a visiting fellow at the University of New South Wales in Canberra. Dr. Weinberg's research focuses on political behavior, trust, and leadership, with work that spans from democratic education to the psychology of political elites. His recent research combines interviews with national politicians from 5 democracies and empirical testing using a longitudinal UK public sample. He explores how increased political contact and authentic communication can serve as tools for building trust, moving beyond performative politics towards a meaningful engagement. Dr. Weinberg is widely published in top journals, and his books, including Who Enters Politics and Why and Governing in the Age of Distrust, have significantly influenced the study of political trust. His contributions have all been recognized through multiple awards. Additionally, in 2022, he was named one of 50 influential researchers shaping 21st century politics by the Apolitical Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. James Weinberg. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ksenia. That was an extremely flattering introduction. Thank you for that. Very kind of you. So it's a pleasure to be here to join this webinar series and to talk about a paper that I published, probably 18 months ago now, on strategies that politicians can use to build trust in office. I won't labor the context here. I'm sure if you've already been attending this webinar series, you've got a good sense that trust is perennially important, but possibly even more so over recent years. Events from Brexit, the election of Donald Trump, the second election of Donald Trump, these have all cast an increased spotlight on the increase in distrust, the rising skepticism we can see in established liberal democracies and those that are still emerging. And that is replete across media headlines as well as public discourse and academic research. I'm sure you've seen lots of these before in previous webinars, but huge volumes of empirical work now over time suggesting that politicians are stuck in a bit of a rut when it comes to comparative estimates of their trustworthiness by comparison to other professions. And that's across lots of countries here, just taking the Ipsos Global Trustworthiness Index as one example. But what's interesting for me is that in the last couple of years, trust has also become more and more prominent in political rhetoric. Prominent politicians in all of these countries where trust is a problem are starting to address it and make pledges about restoring it more openly than they previously did. Here we've got Tusk at a speech he was giving, I think, at the University of Warsaw, where he was talking about the need to regain mutual trust, the idea that we must believe once again that words spoken by government representatives mean something for longer than 1 week. And here in the UK, where I'm talking today, we have a prime minister who last summer, only 2 weeks into office, started a King's Speech where he was laying out the policy proposals that were going to define the next 4 or 5 years by saying the fight for trust is the battle that defines our political era. So even if we as academics or an academic community have been talking about trust for a while, politicians and the public are starting to match that level of attention in the way that they're speaking about trust and how commonplace it's becoming in public discourse. Yet comparably little time has actually been given over to researching the trust building strategies that politicians can use, as opposed to theorizing the meanings of trust, its trajectory, measurements, consequences, predictors. These are all the things that we tend to talk about in academia, but we give less attention to solutions. And in this particular paper, what I wanted to ask was, from a solutions focused perspective, what can politicians do to rebuild trust? This is the puzzle, if you will, behind the paper. And in answering this question, I start with politicians as my agents of change. Rather than thinking from a bottom-up perspective, I start by asking, well, what could we learn from politicians, or what could politicians give us to help answer this question? And where most of the thinking in political science on the solutions to trust building have tended to focus on policy performance, which denudes individual politicians of any agency by instead focusing on the diffuse impacts of government performance. What I do here is take an approach that's more grounded in leadership studies or management organizational psychology by saying, okay, well, actually, leaders at all levels, whether they're in politics or elsewhere, can probably make a difference to how trusted they are by giving their followers the good reasons or warrants to trust in them above and beyond the transactional incentives that come with the classic performance perspective and the institutional outputs and policy performances of government. So I'm thinking here about micro agency to some extent. What is it that individual politicians, even those who aren't in the government, can do? And taking that a step further, what could we actually achieve by thinking of politicians as co-producers in this work? So I start by trying to assess politicians' own understanding of trustworthy leadership and use their insider perspectives as a bit of a launchpad for empirical testing. And this idea came from a project I was doing at the time, funded by the Leverhulme Trust, all about politicians' trust perceptions. So that work was trying to assess how much do politicians feel trusted or distrusted or mistrusted, and does that impact their behavior? But within that study, which was largely quantitative, I did some complementary interviews with 51 politicians spread across a number of countries that were participating in the survey-based part of the project. And within those interviews, I included a question, what do you think can be done to build political trust? And these interviews were taking place at the end of 2020 into February 2021. So thinking about the time of this, we'd been through the early months of COVID, but it was still very much with us. And politicians were certainly in the UK and in lots of other countries as well, were increasingly under the spotlight for transgressing some of the instructions that were being given to mass populations. So trust was really on the forefront of lots of conversations about politicians and politics at that time. So I took the answers to this particular question within these 51 interviews. What do you think can be done to build political trust? And thematically coded them with two other colleagues who were involved in the project for evidence of trust building strategies that might actually have some practical application. And I only included those strategies where they were mentioned by at least 5 of the 50 participants and from at least 2 or more different countries or legislatures, just to ensure some degree of inter-participant corroboration within what is quite a small qualitative starting point. What did I find? Well, politicians are very conscious of the fact that they need to be not just competent in their jobs, but they also need to be consistent, benevolent, reliable, relatable. They need to have morals that align with common values amongst the general public. And they also need to have integrity in their relations with others. Just because they can articulate this doesn't mean that they necessarily go on to do it, but it was interesting that they had that sense of self-awareness that to some extent they were akin to every other public servant or private sector manager in a leadership role who had to give their followers the good reasons or warrants to trust in them. And one quote here from a UK MP, I think that probably the only way that we can rebuild that trust between politicians and the general public is by integrity, honesty, by being exemplary in the way we carry out our duties. So the key then is to go beyond this overall overarching principle about communicating trustworthiness and try and dig down into the data to see if they were actually coming up with practical strategies for building trust. What myself and colleagues were able to identify were 8 different strategies um, that were prominent in the output of those interviews. And we organized these at 3 different levels, so personal, institutional, and governmental. Personal strategies are actions that all politicians can take in their daily professional lives, um, whereas institutional strategies relate to large-scale systematic reforms, to process or service. And then finally, governmental strategies are actions or outcomes that depend more on the collective decisions of party leaderships and governments themselves, not individual politicians. So the individual logics here between or behind these strategies are as follows. You've got political contact or interaction. And here, lots of politicians talked about the fact that in their daily working lives, most citizens only ever encounter them through mediation, through a third party filter, and that by virtue of that fact, they very rarely get to communicate their own personal characteristics or trustworthiness directly. And that where they are able to do that, they themselves reflected that they were able to build better relationships. So they talked about the need for more political contact or more resource to increase those moments of interaction in their daily working lives. They talked about authentic communication. Here, this was a kind of general communication strategy that politicians um, built out of contingent promises. So they acknowledge that where promises are given too easily and without proper explanation, they inflate expectations and set themselves up to fail. And on the other side of that, where they're not honest about expected outcomes and the reasons for failure, that also gets them into trouble. Again, politicians were articulating this as a good way to build trust, not necessarily saying that they do it themselves all the time in their daily working life. Institutional strategies, more political education. The claim here from politicians was that citizens would be less likely to be as cynical about politicians' trustworthiness if they understood how the system worked, what politicians have to do on a daily basis, etc., etc. Anti-corruption measures. This was strongly reflected in interviews in South Africa in particular, but interestingly in some of the Western case studies as well. Electoral reform, lots of politicians acknowledged that majoritarian systems were more likely to set up that combative and competitive daily politics that increases perceptions of infighting and distrust or reasons for not trusting. Regulation of social media. Politicians in every single country thought social media was a threat to trust and trustworthiness because of the spread of mis and disinformation about themselves, their colleagues, or political processes, but also acknowledging that some of their colleagues used it for those same reasons. And then at governmental level, you've got that performance perspective that we already know and a lot about from political science and literature that's gone before, but then a final governmental strategy about the need for leaders to engage in compromise and work together rather than fighting and disparaging one another, as we often see. So a bit of data that's not in the paper, if you read the paper. I've just started a new funded project looking at newly elected politicians in a number of different countries. And in the first round of surveys that have just gone out in the first 2 case studies, I presented those 8 trust building strategies to the sample of new politicians participating, and I asked them to rank those strategies by importance. And this is the order in which they were ranked on average across what is roughly just over 100 newly elected politicians in the project so far. And what you can see is that policy performance still matters. It's ranked there as the most important of those 8 strategies for building trust. But those personal strategies also feature strongly. So strategies ranked second and fourth, i.e. authentic communication, political contact, suggest that even newly elected politicians feel a responsibility or some understanding of their own locus of control in this trust equation. And then you can see the rest are ordered as they are. Happy to discuss that more at the end if you would like. So going back then to the paper that I've been asked to present today, I take that qualitative data, those interviews and the strategies that emerge from them, and I try to see if there is any empirical basis to the 2 personal strategies that come out of there. So political contact and authentic communication, and take each of those in turn. So let's start with the first one then. So is there a relationship between political contact and trust in politicians? Well, the palliative effects of intergroup contact have been widely hailed in social psychology as one of the most important psychological interventions to promote social change for decades. Comes from Gordon Allport's text in the 50s about the nature of prejudice, and the way in which intergroup contact might diminish prejudice. Now, whilst it would be extremely remiss to equate that kind of racial or ethnic prejudice that is at the backbone of the contact literature in social psychology with distrust in politicians, the literature has moved in that general direction to encompass this broader set of social divisions and social phenomena. And there are lots of parallels between that literature and what we see with the trust puzzle, insofar as we've got lots of people making personalized trust judgments about politicians, increasingly informed by automatic negative generalizations about the kind of person who goes into politics and having very little direct contact with that group themselves. So the principles of the contact hypothesis then also resonate with what you might see in some of the social science literature on trust as well, particularly that contact allows for new attributional mechanisms that help to shape or reshape trustors' cognitive evaluations of oneself, and reset the equilibrium about mutual expectations and shared norms, by providing that space for the two actors who may previously be antagonistic to share information, communicate directly, present themselves honestly. So despite starting here from the point of politicians themselves talking about political context as a possible strategy, there is a parallel literature that suggests it could have appraisive potential. So I look at testing that with data that I was collecting at the time on a different project, from members of the UK public during COVID. So I was involved in a study, kind of assessing people's experiences and behaviors and political attitudes over a period of 18 months during the COVID pandemic. And the pandemic itself created this moment where trust was constantly up and down, but increasingly short-term fluctuations with long-term trends downwards after that initial bounce or rally around the flag effect. We had rates of contact and communication between politicians and the public increasing, because you got lots of people who were struggling to access appropriate services, whilst complying with lockdown measures, and contacting their politician for help. And you also had policy satisfaction down amongst all groups of voters, which itself is a classic predictor of political trust. So this created quite a unique moment to test whether contact and trust shared a relationship. So what I did was, in some of the waves of the surveys towards the end of the 18 months, I asked members of the public to report how many times they'd been in contact with a politician, but also the types of contacts they'd had with politicians. And if the contact literature from psychology holds out, and the testaments of those political interviews also hold out, then we'd expect citizens who experienced contact during the pandemic to evaluate politicians as more trustworthy, and even more so where that contact was direct, as opposed to indirect. So what did we see then? Well, very quickly, just to scan over some of the descriptives here. As was the case in lots of countries, trust in the UK in this particular panel dropped by about 13%. That's trust in politicians generally. Distrust increased by about 7%. Mistrust remained stable. In terms of contact, only 5% had had physical contact with a politician during those 18 months, which is understandable given that we were in lockdown for lots of that time. But 16% had interacted directly with a politician over email. About half had received generic literature from candidates and incumbents through the post. But contact was still relatively scarce, so fewer than 50% actually selected more than one option. The most common form of contact was vicarious through the media, through news, speeches on television, albeit those kinds of direct speeches that politicians were making at the time to the public to reassure them. and 9% of the sample reported no experience of contact at all over the preceding 20 months. If we just skip to this slide. So moving to some inferential analysis here, some regression analysis of change in levels of trust over time, controlling for demographics, controlling for policy satisfaction. I find that political contact, when used to create a weighted scale, so weighted by both the frequency of contact and the type of contact, as you move up that scale, there was essentially less likely to have been a decrease in trust over the 18 months that we were monitoring. As contact decreased or participants scored lower on that scale, trust was dropping by roughly half a point on the 7-point scale used to measure trust. So evidence then that even after controlling for that kind of performance perspective that we classically talk about in political science, political contact does seem to have acted as a bit of a buffer, if not some sort of magic panacea, to reverse the general effects seen over time during that period. All right, then, the second personal strategy that I go on to look at in the paper is the other one that politicians talked about, this idea of authentic communication. Now, the interpretation of the word authentic or authenticity in political science and trust literature, even in mainstream media and public discourse, tends to denote some sort of idea of being either true to one's moral inner self or some image of being very ordinary. But actually, the interpretation of authenticity that politicians talked about, as I mentioned earlier, was more about a kind of communicative strategy where get past those kind of subjective ideas about what being ordinary means. Put that idea of authenticity to one side for a second, and instead focus on giving full explanations of the reasons why promises may or may not be delivered, and where you fail, give full and honest explanations of the reasons for that, instead of it, engaging in that kind of politicking and blame avoidance behavior that we've come to expect from lots of politicians. And this actually, as I talk about in the paper, this idea of authentic communication mirrors some of the writing on authentic trust in the early noughties by Solomon and Flores, who talked about a type of trust that actually recognized that disappointment and betrayal were likely and were natural or organic parts of any relationship, and that if you were trusting in an authentic way, you were taking into account the chances of distrust, but nevertheless resolving yourself that that relationship was worthwhile. And the kind of benefits of authentic trust that Solomon and Flores talk about come when those betrayals or disappointments happen, because they've already been considered, and it's easier for those two parties to move through that particular moment whilst maintaining some sort of relationship. And I found this idea really powerful, not just because it resonated with what politicians were saying about ways in which they could communicate better, but also because this seems to be highly apposite for the political world in and of itself. So how can we test this then? Well, again, just looking for some sort of preliminary way to see if this has any purchase. I ran a survey experiment, again in the UK, with a relatively small trimmed sample, representative but taken from prolific academic. You might be familiar with that if you're working in academia. And it was a nested experiment with two parts. So in stage one, participants encountered a candidate at a local hustings. And in one of the treatments, that candidate made a series of standard promises about different areas of policy that they would deliver on if elected. Whereas in the other treatment, that candidate made partial promises. So instead of saying, I will do X, they would say, if A and B come to pass, then I will be able to deliver X. Participants then moved to the second stage of the experiment, which happened at a second time point. Here, they were asked to first of all recall whether the kind of the promises and experience they'd had at time point one, sorry. But in this instance, they are encountering a speech given by the politician post-election. They've been elected, and they're talking about the reasons why some of these policy promises haven't been delivered. And in one treatment, they are giving a kind of honest explanation of the various contingent reasons in either the broader economic landscape or likewise that meant they were too constrained to be able to deliver. And in the other treatment, they're trying to pass blame onto the opposition party. And at each stage, I asked participants to rate the candidate on three different types of trust. So cognitive, evaluating competence, integrity, and benevolence, affective orientation, and then a behavioral intentional measure of whether they would vote for them again. The hypotheses here are that politicians who make partial promises would be viewed as more trustworthy than those who make standard promises, whereas you'd also expect vice versa. And then hypothesis 4, politicians who make partial promises and break those promises with honest explanations of failure based on external circumstances will remain more trustworthy and have some of that authentic trust that Solomon and Flores talk about. What do I find? Well, if you just look at stage one, so after that first experience where the candidate has made those promises in that hustings, actually there's very little difference between how trustworthy the candidate is seen, whether they're making partial promises or standard promises. They're seen to be just as competent, just as benevolent, have just as much integrity, which would suggest that partial promises actually, contrary to the expectation, achieve very little, if anything, when altering public trust in politicians. But the argument here is that partial promises aren't useful or effective in the moment they're made. They're useful or effective in a hypothetical future when trust is breached. So to evaluate their importance, I'm more interested in what happens after stage 2 when that politician has broken their promise. I'll skip through then to stage 2. So what we see, if we look here at perceived competence, integrity, benevolence, and effective orientation, is that where the candidate had made partial promises matched with explanations of or honest explanations of betrayal based on extrinsic fault, they actually had the smallest change in perceived competence, integrity, and benevolence, the smallest change in effective orientation from participants, and as you'll see in a second, also the smallest change in the likelihood of voting for them. Whereas the opposite was true for the treatment where the candidate had made standard promises and gone on to match that with explanations of kind of blame avoidance where they were trying to pass blame on to the other party. They saw almost twice as much of a drop in perceived competence, integrity, and benevolence, and roughly 15 to 20% less likely to be voted for again. Okay, so the key messages from the paper then. Very simply, first off, from the qualitative part of the paper, politicians do have clear ideas about what they can and should be doing to tackle the trust deficit. And actually, despite a kind of general tendency to avoid engaging with them directly on this topic, because they are often seen as complicit in the problem, there is a way to engage with them cautiously and see them as potential co-producers within a broader body of work in this area. Two personal strategies stand out from politicians' own reflections, that in this case being political contact and authentic communication. Two strategies that have parallel literatures, though not necessarily in political science, looking at trust and trust building and politicians. But when it comes to testing them empirically, these preliminary tests I've reported here would indicate some sort of appraisive potential that would suggest there's more there to be investigated. Next steps, I'm now working on two other projects. So the Campbell project I already mentioned is evaluating how new politicians who've just taken office cope on the job, evaluate their own successes, but also build trust both vertically and horizontally in those early days and over the first year of being elected. And then the other project I'm working on at the moment, funded by the Transatlantic Partnership, the PodTrust project, is looking at how we can use new digital technologies to facilitate trustworthy contact at scale. And that project is partly born out of these preliminary findings I shared here in this presentation, but also born out of other work done by my co-investigators in Canada and France and Poland. Good. All right. If you want to learn any more, I think Ksenia also already mentioned these two books, but they might be useful if you're interested in trust and politicians and political leadership, and want to know a little bit more about the research that I've done in the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James, for the very interesting presentation. We are now back to our audience for their questions, comments, remarks, observations. Please raise your hand if you would like to speak up, or you can post your comment in chat. Yes, Pippa, please go ahead. Oh, Pippa, you are still muted.
There we go. Hi, James. How are you? Nice to hear from you. Two questions which arise. Number one, the actor. Is this contextual? In other words, is your research about politicians? Or is it actually something that can be applied more abstractly? For example, trust in doctors, trust in science, trust in universities, trust in institutions. So if the argument is that it's about contact, which means understanding and knowledge about another actor, presumably it can be extrapolated to other more abstract actors and institutions. If it's only about politicians because they're sui generis, then obviously that gives it a narrower focus. And the second question is the normative assumptions. And I know you've done this in your other work. So above all, what happens when we have a completely untrustworthy demagogue or other type of actor, and some people might come to mind. What's the normative assumptions which are so intrinsic in this area about the worthiness and value of trust? As you know, in my own work, I say we should be mistrustful. This is wonderful if you have a corrupt actor or you have an actor who's not serving your own interests. And simply emotive trust, which you can get by contact, is not a basis for rational actor, which is about are they actually going to serve your interests? So communication is one thing, what maximizes trust, but the normative assumption is basically problematic if the actor themselves are untrustworthy. Those are the two thoughts that came to mind. So any thoughts on that would be great.
Brilliant. Thank you, Pippa. And it's really nice to see you, by the way. Hope you're well. The first question, are these strategies generalizable? They are. And actually, that is part of the merit, I think, here in trying to bring them over to politics and political science and thinking through how they work for politicians. I'm particularly interested in the decades of research we have in other literatures, the organizational science literature, the leadership literature, the social psychology literature, on dozens of strategies for building trust that we tend to ignore in political science because we think there is this particularly unique kind of aspect about holding office. And it is unique. We shouldn't play that down. But all of these individuals who are elected to office are also building relationships. And the notion of building a relationship and building one based on trustworthiness is not unique to politics. So yes, the idea of contact and authentic communication, both of those are strategies that are generalizable to other professions. And I think we can learn a lot from where those have been studied in the health service, in education, in management. The normative assumptions, I agree with you. I do agree with you. And maybe I don't make enough of it in this particular paper because I'm so focused on trying to find ways to just turn the dial on some of those trust judgments. Ideally, what we'd want is a kind of systematic process for increasing moments of contact in a more warranted way. And maybe my naive ideal type would be that you'd have these moments of contact that allow citizens to actually get hold of those warrants for whether they should trust or not, or to exercise their skepticism in the way that you've praised and talked about in your own work. I accept, however, in those moments of contact, there will be a power imbalance. That citizen comes to that moment probably less confident, maybe less informed, and less able to assess whether those warrants are genuine or not. And maybe a skilled politician with malintent might manipulate that moment. So I think there's more to do to think about how we design contact in a way that allows it to lead to that warranted trust and not reinforce blind trust, and something I'm thinking about in the Pod Trust project. But I haven't got an answer to that right now.
Could I just follow up quickly? What, do one more? Just on that last point, think about stakeholder meetings. There's often a common way of doing these sorts of contacts where you, for example, in Bangladesh, where you can't trust the politicians, they're corrupt, etc. And so in a local village, there'll be a stakeholder meeting, and above all, there's a mediator. So it's not simply the citizen, but basically the parents turn up and they say, where's the school books? You spent the money. And the politicians say, well, they're on the way. But there's always an independent mediator. It could be judiciary, it could a judge, or it could be a journalist, or it could be any independent person who says, well, let's. So the information is not unfiltered. It's not simply what the politician says. And that seems to me absolutely critical. Otherwise, all you're getting is more trust in promises which are not valid or whatever. So there are direct forms of participation in democracies which could be a model for how we have mediated information. And obviously, the media provides another source of verification. But in small group meetings, that might be another way of doing it, right? Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Pippa. I would just come back to Pippa there and say that when we're going to be running field experiments in the Pod Trust project. We've got MPs who've signed up to run interventions and a variety of them in about 18 months' time. And if I may, I might come back to you, Pippa, just to sound out some of the interventions we design, see if they pass muster. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. While we're waiting for the further hands to be raised, I wanted to ask you something myself. More specifically, how universal is this extrapolation effect? You were speaking about authentic communication between citizens and politicians, but politicians is a very diverse group. You would usually meet politicians at the local level, maybe region. I don't know how often politicians from the national level are available for meetings. But additionally, in many European countries, we have multi-party system. So you would have a politician from your supported party or many opponent parties. So does, for instance, meeting a politician from the party that one supports translates into overall trust to all politicians? Does meeting a politician from your local community council or city council will it also translate into the trust at the national level? Are there any peculiarities of this process? Are there any limits how far this trust boost can go as a result of this direct interaction with politicians?
Thank you, Ksenia. So it's a really interesting one. It's again a question that's embedded in the next project I'm doing. The data I presented in this paper from COVID, from the UK and the COVID longitudinal sample, which suggests that there is some sort of trickle over effect between those specific trust judgments and more diffuse trust in politicians when it comes to experiences of contact. Obviously, that moment of contact itself is designed to enhance or provide an opportunity to enhance the trust-based relationship between an actor, a politician, and a member of the public. But we know that people tend to use individual politicians or individual experiences as heuristics for making judgments about politicians as a class. So it's entirely possible that a positive moment of contact with a politician would enhance that broader level of trust in politicians generally or institutional trust. But I can't say for sure until we've tested that in this next project. In terms of the other point you made about opposition versus in-group, I think that's really interesting. And I think it begs a question that actually predates the moment of contact, which is, are there ways in which how do we encourage someone whose partisan identity is opposite to that of their local representative to actually engage in contact in the first place? Or if they do engage in contact and they have a really positive experience, are they so likely to engage in partisan motivated reasoning that the positive nature of that experience um, is kind of eradicated? Or vice versa. If someone comes in to a moment of contact with a politician of the same partisan identity and has a terrible experience, do they engage in selective attribution to explain away why that was a terrible experience and still trust that politician anyway? So these are a series of counterfactuals, I suppose, that I don't have empirical evidence to kind of definitively answer one way or the other, but they're all scenarios in which I would like to test in this next project I've just begun.
Thank you very much, James. We have a next question from Claudia.
Yes, thank you for the very interesting insights you gave. I did also some interviews, qualitative interviews within our project, and Austria has changed, and one topic were the scandals, political scandals. What do you think? Which kind of scandals have the most influence? Is it the financial ones? And the second question is about you have mainly countries with the predominant two-party system. Do you see any main difference, or you have questions by identifying predominant two-party systems to multi-party systems? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. I'm just writing down some notes so I don't forget your two questions. So the first one was about scandals. Which types of scandals might affect trust the most? I guess that's a question slightly outside of this particular paper, but I'm happy to think about that and chat about it. I think what we know from existing work is that citizens' perceptions of politicians and how much they trust them tend to match that ABC model. They are making judgments about ability, benevolence, and integrity, ABI model, sorry. And benevolence and integrity tend to do more of the work. So classically, we thought it was always about competence, but more recently with scandals like the Partygate scandal in the UK and similar scandals elsewhere during COVID, lots of the longitudinal data suggests that actually those judgments about benevolence and integrity are just as important. So I think rather than saying there is one particular breed of scandal that affects trust the most, I would say that when it comes to analyzing any scandal, is there a personal dimension in which someone has betrayed a sense of caring for an entire community and its values, or has betrayed a lack of integrity that goes above and beyond just falling foul of some loopholes? The second one, multi-party versus single party. So this is interesting. What I found really fascinating from the qualitative data, which was part of a bigger quantitative study with politicians in different countries, was that the politicians in South Africa, where they have closed list multi-member PR, were just as likely to try and talk about these personal trust building strategies as governmental ones, even though in their system there's less of that electoral link. There's less incentive, as it were, or at least electoral incentive for them to be using these personal strategies rather than trying to big up the party image and supporting governmental interventions. And that speaks, I guess, to long literature we've got on personal vote and personal vote seeking, and the fact that lots of politicians think that their actions on a day-to-day basis matter a lot more than they do in terms of the impact on public attitudes and behavior.
Thank you very much, James.
Thank you.
If anyone has a question, please raise your hand. In the meantime, we have a question in chat. Can you develop some examples of authentic and non-authentic communication? I think you mentioned already that social media is a problem, but it's interesting because it allows you to sort of cover a very big audience, but obviously it's not an authentic communication tool. Can you please develop more on this?
Yes, so authentic communication, the way that the politicians were talking about it, and the way that I use in the survey experiment as well, had these two constituent parts. It was about communicating intentions and communicating failures. And to do that authentically, the the message that in some cases was explicit, in other cases implicit in those interviews, was that intentions need to be communicated contingently. It's not enough to constantly say, I will go and do something if you support me. If you trust me, I will do X or Y, because that heightens expectations and sets up a moment of failure that is irreconcilable. Instead, if you say, for instance, instead of saying, I'm going to grow the economy by, 5%, and that's the party line, and I'm promising that we're going to deliver it. You say, okay, well, if the international climate allows and we continue to invest in X, Y, and Z, then we should be able to grow the economy by 5%. So that would be a contingent equivalent of that standard promise. And then when it comes to failure, the message was politicians need to do less of the blame avoidance rhetoric, i.e., something's gone wrong, I haven't delivered, I need to detract from my own misgivings or detract from the reasons why I wasn't able to deliver, and point instead at the opposition. They need to do less of that and instead talk honestly and openly about why they couldn't do something. So, in the case of the last couple of years, COVID was a good example. A natural disaster struck. Here were the constraints that imposed upon us. Here was the impact on the economy, and in the context of that, we weren't able to deliver A, B, or C. And they argued that that kind of explanation was much more effective, and linked those two different type of rhetorical devices. They saw that as a form of authentic communication. Does that help? I can't remember who asked that question.
Yes, thank you, James. Ladislav, are you happy with the answer? Yes, thank you. So just to summarize, authentic communication is about the content of the messages, but not so much about the communication tools per se. That could still be electronic, digital, etc.
Yes. Sorry, I didn't pick up on that, the nuance in your question there. But yes, it doesn't matter how it's communicated, it's the frames with which it's communicated.
Great, thank you. We have a next question from Celine.
Yes, thanks a lot. And sorry, I wasn't able to join from the beginning because I just had half of your presentation, so sorry for that. Maybe my question would be linked to that, but already what I heard was already. I think it's your projects are very interesting. I have three questions. The first one is: did you test local, national, European? Actors, communication, and so because we have this usual thinking that local politicians are have more proximity, they are more contact with people, and so because of that they could be more trustful. But what we see nowadays, for example, in France at the moment, but not only in France, there are really, really a lot of problems because there are conflicts at the local level, which are building lots of distrust. And some mayor, particularly in small town, they don't find mayors anymore because it's too much conflictual. So proximity can bring conflict. So I was wondering if you have something on that. Second question is linked to the work of Isabelle Guinaudot. I don't know if you know her, but she's working on her promises, and I see relation between what you've been testing and her work. But she's not testing if it's the kind of communication as you say, but she's testing if the promise is really precise or not precise, and the issue as well. As you said here, you said if it's growing. I'm promising if it will grow by 5%, and she's saying you can promise that it will grow, or you can promise it will grow with something really precise. And she's testing a lot of things like this. And so I was wondering if you had this kind of test as well in your communication. When you're testing communication. And my third question is just that you're talking about projects which involve, you said French, 4 countries, and I was wondering who you are working with, but maybe it's in the paper, or and particularly who are you working with in France, because obviously I was interested to know who you are working with in France.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Celine. There was lots there. Yes. So the local national comparison that's a really interesting one. So there weren't local politicians involved in the qualitative sample that was the starting point for the paper. So I don't have a sense of whether they would generate the same types of trust building strategies as national politicians. Based on what you're saying there, they might actually suggest the opposite, that they need fewer points of contact if contact is creating moments of contest and conflict. Although from a democratic perspective, we might say that's healthy and that's good. I do know from the public perspective, having gathered data that differentiated between public perceptions of MPs and public perceptions of local councillors, that I saw in that panel that I reported exactly the same trends. So contact for members of the public with local politicians, again, reduced the likelihood that their trust in local politicians dropped over the course of the 18 months on the panel. So it was a mirror image of the trends I was seeing with their perceptions of national politicians. In general, though, we do know that people trust their local politicians more. Take my data out of this. There are lots of other panel studies and longitudinal studies that suggested local politicians in the UK, where I was collecting data, fared much better than national politicians. And that was because a lot of the services that were required during the COVID pandemic were, well, kind of devolved to local politicians to implement or deal with. Their casework increased just as much as national MPs, and they were doing a lot more on the front line. So yes, I imagine there is a slightly different story to tell for local politicians. It's an interesting one, and I'll definitely factor that into future questions I ask about contact. Isabel, I don't know Isabel, but I will go away and look up Isabel and find out more about her work. And maybe if I am doing some of this authentic communication testing again, then maybe I can reach out to her and work with her on that. The study I mentioned in different countries, so that PodTrust project, it's Elizabeth Dubois in Canada, Karolina Koch-Michalska at SciencePo in France, chap in Poland whose surname I can't remember, his first name's Damien. That's not very good, is it? I should remember all of my co-I's surnames. And then myself and Kate Dommett in the UK, and we've each got postdocs and PhDs attached to that. But yes, we only started that project 4 months ago, so we're still in the early stages of conceptualizing different forms of contact, different moments of interaction, and different technologies that might facilitate better or worse forms of contact in politics. But yeah, I can share the findings as we get them and as we test them in later months and years of the project.
Thank you very much, James. We have one more question from Claudia, I think.
Yes, I hope I can remember it correctly. You said from strategies from this Campbell project that on second place was authentic communication. And you also mentioned social media as a threat to trust. So what we have now in Austria, for instance, is that far right-wing parties do a lot of their campaigns over social media and were very, very successful. So do you see why is that? Or could you maybe give me some interpretation? Because it's not only in Austria that far right-wing parties use more the social media for campaigning. So this doesn't go for me with it's a threat to trust. So maybe you can explain it to me.
Yes, so I mean, I don't think it's just far right parties in Austria that have managed to optimize the use of social media to communicate with certain social groups and build their trust. I think Pippa could talk to this much more eloquently than me, but I think the reach that those parties get with social media, the echo chambers and communities of thinking that they can build, they allow for certain messages to be repeated in a way that cements a blind trust. They prey on what people want to hear, what people need in communities that are struggling to be resilient because maybe they have been on the wrong side of poor public service delivery, economic decline, global pandemics, etc. And social media allows those parties the space to prey on those people, essentially. Authentic communication, though, in the way that politicians were talking about it in this project, is quite different. It was more about, as I said before, a form of promise making, a form of policy proposal, and a form of failure explanation. It was less about winning hearts and minds on social media, which itself is obviously a big area of research. What I should say in terms of the trust link, though, is that when those far-right parties exploit social media to build traction, build blind trust, and that converts into electoral success. So thinking here about the Reform Party in the UK that's just done very well in our local elections, now they actually have to prove that they can do it, right? Governing is hard, it's messy, it's full of contingencies, and it's very hard for populist or far-right parties to deliver when they get in office. And that often leads to a spiral of distrust because the people who placed blind trust in them prior to the election realize they can't deliver what they said they were going to deliver. And so I'm no better off than I was before.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. I think we have reached the end of our time, unless there is any more urgent question, how politicians can build trust. This seems not to be the case. I hope you don't mind if colleagues follow up with you by email should anyone has another question.
Of course, yeah.
So thank you so much for the excellent presentation, James. It has been a very interesting material. As you can see, it raised many questions and gave us many thoughts for future directions in our research. Thank you everyone for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinars. This session will be available on our project YouTube channel should you wish to watch it again. Thank you all. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.